Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on an update about how to plug in for advocacy during this General Assembly session with Fund Our Schools. My name is Brianna Nomi, and I'm the education organizer with the Youth Justice Program at Legal Aid Justice Center, and also helping to lead the Fund Our Schools Coalition.
And my name is Chad Stewart, and I'm the Manager of Education Policy and Development at the Commonwealth Institute. And I'm also a member of the Fund Our Schools Coalition and help coordinate as well. So I'm going to kick things off today and just go over our agenda. So first off, just going to go over where we are in the state right now for our K-12 funding efforts. Then I'm going to go over what are the standards of quality and what are opportunities to plug in this year for the legislative session. And then Brianna's going to go over advocacy opportunities in our new virtual world for legislative session. So to kick things off, let's talk about where Virginia's K-12 funding stands currently. So just a few background statistics to ground us. So first off, it's important to understand Virginia as what's known as a high capacity, low effort state. And by high capacity, that means we're in the top 10 of states for household median income. And by low effort, we're in the bottom tier across a variety of K-12 funding metrics for what we provide for students in the state. So an example of this is this chart that you see in front of you, which is from our legislative research arm in the state, which shows that we are 40th in the country for a state per pupil funding for pre-K through 12, hovering between states like Missouri and Mississippi. When you look at our funding effort, a recent report by the Education Law Center gave Virginia a D grade for our funding effort. So that took into account our per capita income in the state and also the effort in which we spent on K-12 education. When you look at how competitive our teacher pay is, a recent report by the Economic Policy Institute said Virginia had the least competitive teacher pay in the country when you compared it to other adults with bachelor's degrees. And another important thing to note is that we made major cuts in the wake of the Great Recession, structural cuts to our education formula that are still with us today. And when we account for inflation, we're still down in state expenditure per pupil. And if we were spending at levels that we were spending at in 2009, we'd be spending hundreds of millions more at the state level for K-12 education at this time. So we've never recovered from those cuts made right after the Great Recession. And another important thing to know about some of the inequities we see in our education system is that we rely heavily on localities for education spending in this state. And obviously some localities, because of their wealth, have more revenue to spend on their schools. That's where you see big discrepancies when you account for local and state revenue at the division level. So overall, we have a required match that localities have to meet for getting state funds, but localities across the state spent more than $4.2 billion above what was required in 2020. And obviously, counties like those in Northern Virginia, like Arlington and Fairfax, can spend far more than lower income counties like those in a lot of our areas in Southside Virginia and Southwest and cities throughout the state that just don't quite have the same revenue base. So there's a clear pathway, fortunately, this year for implementing some substantial changes that would increase revenue and direct it to communities and schools that need it most. And that's the School Equity and Staffing Act. And this is patroned by Delegate Aird and Senator McClellan. And they also put in last year, and even though it didn't pass last year, they're they put in again this year, and it's based on the Virginia Board of Education's prescribed standards of quality. So usually every 2 years, the Virginia Board of Education prescribes new standards of quality, and these are the minimum standards that the board says we need to meet as a state to provide an adequate education to our students. And then it's up to the General Assembly to fund these standards. Now, the standards put forth by the board dealt with a variety of things, increasing our counselor and nurses ratios and creating a new equity fund to direct dollars to schools based on their share of low-income students. And all in all, when you account for lifting a old support cap that was put in place in 2010 and funding the new prescribed standards of quality, it's around $1 billion a year. And the General Assembly last year bucked at that and did not fund that amount, just because that's such a large amount that it would normally call for finding a new revenue stream in order to fund. But the General Assembly does have the responsibility to figure that out and find it. And so we're encouraging them to pass this bill this year in order to start providing an adequate source of revenue for schools throughout the state. So that's probably the biggest piece of education legislation that's up this year. So far, it's passed in the House subcommittee and hasn't been heard in the Senate subcommittee yet. But we are keeping close tabs on it at Fund Our Schools, and we're giving regular updates through our email and also on social media. And the second big advocacy opportunity this year is for protecting no-loss funding. Now, the governor in his proposed budget put in more than $500 million to protect state funding from enrollment declines. And because of the pandemic this year, we've seen massive enrollment declines across all of our divisions in the state. And usually the state updates their formulas and then they provide state funding partially based on a school's enrollment. And so if that were to take place again, then schools would see major declines in revenues that they've come to rely on. Now, we're grateful that the governor put this in his budget to kind of protect schools and provide them an added layer of stability in this very challenging year. But that's not a guarantee that the House and Senate are going to continue to fund this in their budgets. And ultimately, we need the House and Senate to support this effort so that the final state budget has this protected funding for schools. So there's a major advocacy opportunity right now to get in touch with lawmakers in the House and the Senate and talk to them about the importance of protecting this no-loss funding for schools this year to provide them that layer of stability. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brianna, who's going to go over different advocacy opportunities for plugging in this session in a virtual world.
Thanks, Chad. So I'm happy to be here today to talk with you all about ways that you can plug in during this virtual session. As you know, this legislative session is being done virtually, which means Fund Our Schools has really had to pivot our advocacy strategies to virtual strategies as well. So I'm going to share with you a few ways that you can plug in with our advocacy this session. Some of these advocacy strategies you'll be familiar with. You've likely called or emailed your lawmaker directly, and you can still do this. If you are unsure of who your lawmaker is, there's a link on this slide that you just follow. You can type in who'smy.virginiageneralassembly.gov/ to determine who your lawmaker is. And then you can reach out to them and ask them to support the various legislation, budget amendments, constitutional amendments that Fund Our Schools is supporting. The General Assembly is also accepting written public comments and inviting members of the public to join their Zoom committee and subcommittee meetings. So we have a series of graphics that outline how to do both of these things that we have made available on our website. So if you'd like to take a look at that, it walks you through the process of engaging with those subcommittee and committee meetings via written public comment or live testimony. essentially what you'll do is you find the appropriate meeting where legislation has been docketed, and then you can see a link where you'll be able to indicate your interest in participating using one of these methods. We have also a few resources that will help you in crafting your testimony or public comment. We have one-pager talking points for both SOQs and the support cap. Both of these components are really, really important to be speaking on and testifying in support of, so that our lawmakers know that these are the critical components of the legislation that we need to see enacted and passed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, and as Chad has mentioned, the General Assembly, things are moving really, really quickly. We are, already moving right along in terms of hearing our legislation and our legislation being docketed in committees and subcommittees. So advocacy in terms of which legislators we're targeting is going to change depending on what stage our legislation is in. However, as Chad mentioned earlier, there are several lawmakers that are considered leadership and who make ultimate decisions about the scope, the process, and money decisions. So it's generally safe to say that if you target any one of these leaders, if you're like running short on time or you don't know exactly who needs to hear your advocacy message, that you can reach out to any one of these 4 General Assembly leaders. That's Delegate Eileen Fillercorn, Delegate Luke Torian, Senator Dick Saslaw, and Senator Janet Howell. And any of these General Assembly leaders would be very important for your advocacy. And lastly, there are just some overarching ways that you can get involved with Fund Our Schools and stay up to date about ways to advocate during this session. So you can learn more at our website, which is www.fundourschoolsva.org. We've recently updated this with all of the one-pagers, with our tutorials on how to submit written public comment or live testimony. And we'll be updating the website regularly with resources that will be helpful to you in your advocacy as well. You can also sign up and subscribe to our Inside Scoop email. If you go to fundourschoolsva.org and you enter your information, your email address, you'll get put on a list where we send out regular updates during session and beyond about ways to stay up to date about all Fund Our Schools activity. And lastly, we are on social media. If you follow us on Facebook, you can see whenever we post videos like this, whenever we're advocating, we post photos of our advocates testifying during subcommittee and committee meetings. And we'll also be sharing up to the last minute, any updates that you may need to support your advocacy during the session. So I think that is it in terms of Fund Our Schools. Like I said, things are moving quickly. Information will be updated pretty regularly. So get involved, follow us, and we look forward to seeing you out supporting Fund Our Schools and school funding across Virginia. Thanks for joining us.